What happens when the child you fought to save becomes the one you have to let go of, while still refusing to stop loving them? Today's conversation is one of the most honest and powerful stories I've had the privilege of sharing on this podcast. My guest, Jody Ammerman, opens up about how she wrestled with God, went through chronic pain, had a miraculous healing, and eventually she had to walk through every parent's nightmare, watching her son battle addiction and homelessness. But this conversation is also about shame, secrecy, faith, and learning how to hold boundaries without abandoning people. Welcome to the It's Your Story to Tell podcast. I'm your host, Megan, and this podcast is a place where people share the hard parts of their story honestly, so others know they're not alone and healing is possible. Are you tired of repeating the same patterns, feeling stuck in your story, and wondering if real change is even possible? In my book, Unstuck, Break Free from What's Holding You Back and Create a Life You Love, I walk you through the path from survival to transformation, blending faith, neuroscience, and soul-deep healing. This book, it's not just words on a page. It's a companion for your journey. Whether you've experienced trauma or just feel lost in the noise of life, Unstuck will meet you there with truth, compassion, and tools that actually work. It's time to stop surviving and start living your story with purpose. Grab your copy today on Amazon. Jody, thank you so much for being here and for your willingness to share your story.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
We're going to just jump in and let you take us back on your journey to when you were a young adult. When we first met and spoke, you shared about your own journey of how a health crisis and being dismissed by doctors really shook your faith and identity. So let's let our listeners get to know you and a little bit about your journey.
Yes. Well, I don't have a come to Jesus moment. I don't have a glory saving, moment that I got saved story. I have always in my life have always felt saved. Even as a young child, I felt set apart and felt different. So when I hear people tell stories about how they had this come to Jesus moment, sometimes I'm like, wow, I wish I had one of those, but I just always had Jesus in my life. When I was a late teen, living on my own for the first time, I was going to church and my faith just kept growing stronger and stronger. I went to church twice on Sundays. I went to Bible study on Tuesdays. I went to Bible college on Thursdays. There was another group of young kids with me. I mean, when I say kids, we're talking 19, 20 years old. We would go out and hand out tracts. And I just got so strong in my faith that I didn't realize at the time, but I had become vain in my faith. But I would shout from the rooftops to anybody who would listen, there's absolutely nothing that can separate me from God. There is nothing that will make me walk away from him. That's how much I love him. I don't care. Whatever the circumstances, I would never walk away from God. I would never have a crisis of faith. And I decided to get baptized and my parents were there and it was just a great, wonderful, experience. And when I got baptized, one of the elders of the church spoke over me and he said that your faith in God and your connection to God is like the roots of an oak tree. They go deep and they go strong and they last, but you have to be careful because you have to know when to let people go or else they will tear you down. And I thought, okay, well, that was interesting. I didn't think much of it at the time. Shortly after I got baptized, I started getting this pain. And the only way to describe it is if you've ever sunburned the front of your legs really, really bad, and you get up and then the blood hits that sunburn part and just that throbbing, aching, burning pain. That's what it felt like, but I had that from the waist down. And I would get up from the chair and I would take about 2 or 3 steps and my legs would just crumple and give out. Would go to the doctor and with this back pain and they would take an x-ray and they would tell me that there was nothing wrong with me and send me home. And it grew steadily worse. and it became unbearable. And I went, my church group, we prayed over me. They anointed me with oil. We laid hands. I prayed. I believed. I waited on God to heal me. And it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And I remember going to the hospital and not being able to walk. And then by the time they called me in to, check up on me, I was fine again. And so it was very frustrating. And they would take an x-ray and they would tell me there was nothing wrong and send me on my way. This went on for about 3 years, and the episodes were becoming more and more frequent, more and more painful. And doctors would tell me things like, it's all in your head. I was referred for psychological therapy. I was told that people in my ER with fake back pain trying to get drugs really make me mad. And the irony of that is I never had anything stronger than Tylenol. My pain grew worse. And one night I was walking up the stairs. I was coming back from Bible college, and my neighbor lived down on, so I lived on the third floor of an apartment complex, and he lived down on the first floor, and it was a walk up. We were coming back from Bible college, and we were going to do some studying, and my back went out right there on the second floor landing of that staircase, and I couldn't get up the stairs. And I had been dealing with this at this point for 3 years. I had been waiting on God. I had been people laying hands on me. I had been praying. I had been faithful. I had been sharing the gospel. And I kept waiting on him to heal me. And he just wouldn't. He didn't. And right there on that second floor staircase landing, I had a knockdown, drag out argument with God right there. And I was yelling at him out loud, you know, telling him, I've done this for you and I've done this for you and I've believed, and your word says that, by your stripes I am healed, and I have believed it on you and I've waited on you, but you just lied to me. You just lied because you said you would heal me and you didn't heal me. And my friend, he says to me, he steps back, he says, Jody, stop that. What are you saying? And I turn to him and I says, Rich, God forgive me, but when I go to heaven, I'm not going to go face him as a hypocrite. I'm mad. He said that he was going to heal me and he did not heal me. And it was shortly after that, well, immediately after that, actually, I quit. I quit praying. I quit going to church. I quit reading the Bible. I did everything except I stopped short of renouncing my faith. God let me down. I believed in him and he let me down. A couple weekends later, my best girlfriend came over for the weekend and was spending the night, and there goes my back. And so she gets me to the hospital. I get in there. The doctor takes the x-ray. There's nothing wrong with you. You need to go home. Stop bugging us. And I remembered what I was told about an MRI. And I said, I'm not leaving. And the doctor looked at me and he goes, what do you want? And I said, I want you to put me in the hospital and I want an MRI. He says, your condition does not deserve an MRI. You don't need an MRI. There's nothing wrong with you. And we went back and forth and back and forth. And I finally just leaned against that table and I crossed my arms and I said, if you want me out, you are going to have to call security and have me put out, and I will sue you for malpractice. I want an MRI. And so back then they wrote out their doctor's orders in carbon paper, right? And so he whips out this paper and I could tell how angry he was, because I remember the ballpoint pen was like scratching across the page as he's writing it. And he writes out this order and he snaps it at me and he goes, I'll go one better. Not only did I order you an MRI, but I ordered you a CAT scan. And if there's anything wrong with you, I'll eat my hat. And I took the paper. I said, thank you. And I went home. So I had the CAT scan. Test referrals come, the orthopedic referrals. So the orthopedic surgeon calls me in and he says, your CAT scan's clear. You're wasting your time with the MRI. Okay, but I'm still going to do it. So I have the MRI. It was like on a Wednesday or Thursday. They called me back. We need you to come in on Saturday. We're bringing someone in. We need you to come in. Okay. So I go and get the MRI. Well, it turned out that I had a 4-inch long by 2-inch round hemorrhaging tumor inside my spinal cord that could not be detected on the MR or the x-rays, and it could not be detected on the CAT scan. And I was then taken seriously. I was referred to a neurosurgeon, and I was told, I was 23 years old at this time. This had started happening when I was 19. And I was told that I should expect to wake up paralyzed from the waist down, because it was actually inside the spinal cord. So they would have to cut everything open and get it out. And if they couldn't get it out, that I would expect to probably lose my life. Okay, 23 years old. I haven't done anything yet. I haven't even lived, you know? And so I go back to my apartment and I realized that I needed Jesus. I needed my daddy. And so I would sit there on my little one bedroom, the cutest little apartment. I would sit there in front of the fireplace and I would sit there with the Bible in front of me. But for some reason, I was so blocked that I couldn't bring myself to physically open the Bible. And I couldn't make myself say Jesus' name. I just was completely blocked. So I would just sit there night after night, just longing for him, longing for that closeness, wanting to draw near, wondering why I couldn't say his name. And so one night I got my first vision that I'd ever had in my life. And I can still see it as clear as day as if it happened yesterday. I was in the operating room, and the operating room was made of like cinder block walls, and they were painted like an institution yellow. And I could see all the machines on the walls, you know, where they hold up the x-rays to look at them. And I could see all the machines around. And in my vision, I'm laying on the operating table, and it's right before my surgery, and I'm laying on my back, and my doctor comes up and he's greeting me. So he's standing at my head, and he reaches down and he puts his right hand on my shoulder, and he's talking to me. And in my vision, I saw my doctor talking to me, and I saw Jesus on the left side of me with his left hand on my shoulder and his right hand around my doctor. And in that moment, everything broke free. I was able to pray. I was able to read the Bible. I was able to worship. It was just like the most incredible moment of my life. And I was filled with so much peace and joy that I actually, the day before my surgery, I went down to Tijuana, Mexico, and spent the day with friends. Because I just was so at peace. And it didn't matter to me if I woke up and I was in a wheelchair. I didn't care because I knew that Jesus had me. So the morning of the surgery, they wheel me into the operating room, and there's those yellow cinder block walls. There are those machines on the walls. There's the machines all around me. And when my doctor walked up right here and put his hand on my shoulder and greeted me, I started laughing so hard, laughing, crying, just with joy, to the point that they couldn't even make me stop laughing so I could count backwards so they could put me to sleep. So I was put to sleep laughing in joy of worship of God. When I woke up in the recovery room, I was kicking my feet. My mom was standing there. I'll never forget her face. And she's leaning over me and she says, "What can I do for you? What can I do for you?" And I says, "Mom, I want a jelly donut." I don't even like jelly donuts. I don't know where that came from. So I spent a few days in ICU, and then they moved me to my room and did all the recovery, the physical therapy. You know, it was very hard. And every day when the doctors would do their rounds, I noticed that there were more and more and more doctors that came into my room. So finally I asked one of the doctors, I said, "Why are there so many doctors in here?" And he says, "Because we don't understand your miraculous healing. Your healing is so amazing that it's a miracle." And I thought to myself, well, I understand. And every day the hospital chaplain would come in and, you know, pray. And one day he missed me. So the next day when he came in, I said to him, I says, "Why didn't you come see me yesterday?" And he said, "I did." And he goes, "But you were asleep and I didn't want to wake you." And I said, "No, sir, you wake me up because I need prayer." And he says, "Jody," he says, "you are covered." He says, "The anointing in this room is so thick it's like parting the curtain when I walk into it." Awesome, right? You know, my church family that I had grown so close to, not one of them showed up. Not one of them called. Not one of them followed up. Nothing. They just let me go. I was in the hospital 10 or 11 days, and not a word from these people that I had been so close to for years. And that really broke my heart. I was supposed to be on disability and out of work for 6 months. I was fully healed and returned to work in two months. So one day I remember driving to work, and it was the first time I ever heard God's voice. And he said to me, he says, "Do you see it now?" "God, see what?" I asked. He says, "I did heal you, but in my time, not yours. Because you need to understand that even though you will walk away from me, I will never walk away from you." You know, if the story ended right there, what an amazing gift to know that no matter how far I fall, or no matter how badly I falter, that in my moments of doubt, that he is still there carrying me, even when I can't see him and even when I can't feel him. And if that's where the story ended, like I said, it would be an amazing, because I carry a scar on my back that reminds me every single day since July 23rd, 1990, of what God did for me and how he proved his faithfulness to me. On the 1 year anniversary of my surgery, on July 3rd, 1991, I was in labor with my son, Zach. He missed being born on the anniversary of my surgery by 56 minutes. He was born July 24th at 12:56 a.m. And, so he was a blessing. He was another reminder. Raising my kids, they had the great, like, we had the all-American childhood, church on Sundays, family dinners, always on their sidelines, horses, ranching, rodeo, football games, you name it, all American. There weren't any problems. They were great. And yet somehow both of my sons fell into addiction when they were in their early 20s. My youngest eventually made it out, and he's got an amazing life, married, children, an amazing career, Christian, going to church, just, doing all the things. Unfortunately, my oldest, he still struggles. I thought at one point that he was going to get out of it. That was back in 2016, and he stuck a dirty needle in his arm. That dirty needle caused an infection on his heart valve that I guess is specific to IV drug users, and it's called a vegetation. And normally these vegetations are the size of a pencil eraser. His was the size of a quarter, and it was so big that pieces of it were breaking off and going into his lungs, kind of like emboli.
Mhm.
And so he was misdiagnosed with pneumonia, given the antibiotics, and he kept getting worse and worse. He was living with me at the time, and he was 24 years old. And I kept telling him I'd go to work, and I was working 12-hour days. And I kept telling him, go to the doctor. And I would yell at his younger brother, Michael, take your brother to the doctor. We lived 2 miles from the hospital. And I'd go to work in the morning, and he'd be laying on the couch, and I'd come home 12 hours later and he's laying on the couch, and I was very angry. And one night, my mom had called there while I was at work, and she called me, and she says, Joe, I'm so worried about Zach. And I said, well, Mom, he's a grown man. What can I do? She says, I don't know, Joe. She says, but just do me a favor. When you get home tonight, just look at him. Just turn on the light and look at him. Okay. So I came home. The room was dark. I saw him laying there on the couch, and I felt that frustration and that anger again, like, what is so hard about getting up and going to the doctor? And I started to walk back out, because he was laying on the couch, right, in the living room. And I started to walk out of the living room and go hide in my bedroom, hide from their addiction, hide from all the chaos. And I remembered that I had made my mom a promise. And so I turned around and I flipped on that living room light, and I realized that my son was in crisis and I needed to get him to the hospital immediately. I take him to the ER, and I was so angry because I just thought he was sick. And so I thought, great, I've just worked a 12-hour day. Now I'm going to be here all night long in the emergency room. Tomorrow's Friday. Okay, well, I guess I can get through one day without any sleep. They took one look at him, rushed him back, and it turned out that he was already fully septic. His kidneys were already failing. They admitted him into the hospital for what I thought would be a couple of days. And it turned out to be a 49-day ordeal where I ended up sitting by his deathbed with the doctors telling me every single day that my son was going to die. He had organ failure, liver failure, heart failure, kidney failure. He had a heart attack at 24. They replaced the entire contents of his blood 2 or 3 times. They did thoracentesis. I'm not sure of the pronunciation of that, where they drew almost 2 gallons of fluid off of his lungs. They did dialysis. He was on antibiotics 24/7. He had a heart attack. The heart valve was destroyed, but he was so weak that he could not sustain surgery to repair it. And the doctors, he had 5 different doctors, and they would all come in, and every day they would tell me to prepare myself for my son's demise. And I just, no, no, no. And I panicked, and I'm in my grief, and my soul is screaming because I was so panic stricken that I didn't have the words just to pray. I couldn't articulate. And The devil was whispering in my ear saying, your son's gonna die. You're not saying the right prayers. Your son's gonna die and it's gonna be your fault. And I would go in the chapel or I would walk around the grounds of the hospital and I would just say, God, please, please. And my son would, 3 o'clock in the morning, always 3 o'clock in the morning, he would wake me up. He would call me. I was, in a cot next to his bed, and he would call me crying. And I would wake up and I would go to his bedside and I would ask him, baby, what's wrong? What's wrong? And he says, Mom, I don't think I'm going to make it out of here. And I said, baby, you can't say that because his body was so broken and so sick that if he gave up in his mind, he was going to die. Okay. If he gave up in his mind, he wasn't going to make it. There was no medicine that was going to save him if he quit. And I would tell him, I'd say, son, you can't give up. You've got to fight. And he says, I know, Mom. He goes, I'm trying. He goes, but I'm so tired and I hurt so bad that I don't think I'm going to make it home. And I would grab his face, right really close to his face. Don't you die on me. You don't get to die. You do not get to die. And I would go to the chapel and I would get down on my knees and I would beg God, please, God, take my life instead. Don't take my son. Take my life. And this went on night after night after night. Sorry.
Oh, goodness. No apologies. This is hard to talk about.
Yeah, it's been 10 years. One day, it was on a Sunday after dialysis. The room was dimly lit because we had the curtains closed, and he was laying there and he was sleeping, and I was just sitting next to him quietly, holding his hand. TV was off. It was just he and I. And God spoke to me again, and he said, do you see it now? Which seems to be a theme because apparently I'm not seeing things he wants me to see. Do you see it now? And I said, see what? And he says, I was preparing you then for this because he needs to understand how powerful I am, even to the brink of death. Yeah. And I realized, though, in that moment, that God knew my son before I did. And I realized that it was all connected, and he was preparing me. And he had me go through that desert so that I would not lose faith in this crisis as a parent. And it was the most beautiful thing, and I had this, and I don't know if it's a vision or what it is, but I have always carried this overwhelming feeling that my son will become a minister or will become a pastor or whatever. It's like there's this lingering vision in my head of my son standing on a stage behind a podium, and I'm seeing it like I'm standing behind him, and it's outdoors, and he's speaking, and there's thousands of people in front of him. And so once again, I'm waiting on God, hoping and praying.
Well, thank you for walking us through your story and showing us just how God was working in you to prepare you for navigating this. And I think when we're in the midst of our really hard things, it's hard to want to even accept that there's a plan for this. And people who have listened to the podcast have heard a lot about my story and how God prepared me for the last, from 2023 to 2025, walking through some of the hardest things with my youngest daughter. You had sent me a message about the wilderness, and I've been writing in Substack on that and how God walked me in wilderness for so long, and yet all of it had purpose.
Yes.
And it was preparing me to be the mother that when she was returned to me, that I could lead her in healing. And I am believing with you about what God is going to do in your son's life and the ministry that he's going to have and the testimony. And in part 2, we're going to talk a little bit more about even how we got connected, which is so interesting. I used to live in the town that you live in.
Yes.
And we're in a Facebook group. And in that group, you were sharing a story about your son. And we're going to talk about that in our next part and how you decided that you were no longer going to keep a secret and let shame write your story. And it started something you had no idea a few weeks ago that you would be doing, and the group that you would be stewarding for other parents walking with children in addiction, called Keep the Light On. So you guys come back and listen to part 2, where we're going to get to hear how God in real time, like this is just happening in the last few weeks, about how God is using this story to make a difference in the lives of others. Thanks so much for being here.